And now, let me quickly introduce our first panel, which features the team that won the 2024 Collier Prize, a collaboration between the Texas Tribune, ProPublica, and Frontline. With us today, reporters Lomi Kriel, wave Lomi, Zach Despart, and research reporter Lexi Churchill. Our moderator is Ted Bridis, senior investigative lecturer at the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications. Ted is a decorated investigative reporter with the Associated Press before joining the University of Florida, and the person who ran the Collier Prize competition from its inception. Ted?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to set the stage, to talk about the work that they did, I want to remind everyone, so we'll go back to May of 2022 in Uvalde, Texas. The tragic shooting at Robb Elementary by a former student, 18-year-old Salvador Ramos. The death toll was 19 students and 2 teachers, and 17 others were injured. What was sadly and tragically sort of notable about this instance was he remained in the classrooms for 74 minutes, for more than an hour, before the U.S. Border Patrol tactical unit breached the classroom finally and fatally shot him. And so that delay, after a generation of school shootings that we've all experienced, and after police departments and police agencies have learned you've got to be proactive and sort of rush the shooter, and for the fact that that there was that lapse was particularly notable, and was really the focus of their really excellent journalism. The shooting took place, this was not in their backyard, even by Texas standards. It took place about 3 hours from Austin, where 2 of them were based, and 4.5 hours from Houston, where 1 was based. So I think we're going to start with some clips. These are body camera video, audio interviews, audio recordings from the scene. So trigger warning, there's some upsetting visuals here. But this was among, and we'll talk about this was among a source dump, a confidential source providing all of 2 terabytes of information that really fueled their exclusive reporting on this, and we'll talk about how they processed that and how they obtained what ultimately led to some really revelatory reporting.
All right, so I'm going to play some clips for you, and I just want to add to what Ted said. There were nearly 400 officers there that day, many of them arriving pretty quickly into the response, and they were from about 24 state, local, and federal agencies. So we're going to watch a few clips.
Do we have anyone that's hit on this side? Huh? Any of the kids or anyone hit?
No, we don't know anything about that. No kids are.
Everything's closed. Like the kids are not in there. Can we check with the officer to be sure if anyone's? It's either 111 or 112.
You don't see any bodies. You don't see any blood. You don't see anybody yelling, screaming for help. Those are motivators for you to say, hey, get going, move. But if you don't have that, then slow down.
Room 12? Where's room 12? Full of victims. Child called 911 saying the room is full of victims. What? The room is full of victims. Child 911. Child 911 call.
Room 12.
Shh. Don't know, brother.
Room 12.
These are.
Somebody said victims room 12.
No, we hadn't heard that. No, we're in the fours, right? This is building fours.
Anybody hurt?
No, not here. No, sir.
Yes, there are.
Here?
Yeah.
EMS in there already?
No, sir. We have an shooter still in there.
Yeah.
He's in here.
He's in here. Yeah.
I'm just gonna stand right here. Be ready.
The last contact, hey, hold on. Last contact we had was one of our school PD officers. His wife is a teacher. She called him saying she's not.
They just had a kid in room 12.
Yeah, they had
a kid in room 12. Multiple victims, room 12.
Maybe 15, 20 minutes, maybe. Somebody finally found the master key. We tried it on the janitor doors there was a janitor door where we were on either side of the hallway. We tried it on those, it worked. We were stacked on the hallway leading to the room. Just getting ready to make entry.
At 12:50, 77 minutes after the gunman entered Robb Elementary, the officers move in on room 111.
Okay. Let's get kids. Kids, let's get kids. You okay? What's your fire? Kids.
The BORTEC commander, he finally gets the right key from a school employee, puts it in the door, opens the door. The gunman jumps outside of a closet and fires at BORTEC officers at the front of the stack. He grazes one of them in the head. Multiple officers fire back and hits the gunman and kills him.
EMTs first.
What we later learn, and the state committee that examined the response determined, is that the door was likely unlocked this entire time. Okay, so we're gonna skip, unfortunately, through the rest of the videos because we don't have all the time.
I kept going back to who?
I'm gonna kick it to Zach.
So I'm going to talk about the investigative trove that Ted had mentioned at the beginning of our presentation. So the shooting had happened in May of 2022. And one of the first things that we and many other news organizations had done was file just tons of records requests to the many relevant law enforcement and government organizations in Uvalde who had responded to the shooting to begin the reporting process on what had happened and more specifically what had went wrong. So clearly in the response to the shooting, all of those government organizations had denied the records requests, had cited exemptions under Texas records laws to not fulfill those requests. So that was a brick wall very early on in that process that prevented really any important investigative reporting from happening, which was really frustrating, especially because the initial police narrative, if you remember in the early days of the Uvalde shooting, that the police initially said that their response was good, was effective, was false. We were unable to effectively evaluate what went wrong and why. We had to figure out, okay, how do we get around the refusal of these government agencies to release this information and find another way to do this? So we were able to find a confidential source to release to us this investigative trove. It was, like Ted said, a couple terabytes of information, which enables us to do the following 2 years of investigations that was the work that eventually wins us this prize, but really a ton of other investigations. So when we say investigative trove, what do we mean? This is body camera footage. This is the crime scene photos that investigators took. This is all of the radio traffic from all of the agencies. Like Lomi mentioned, there was more than or almost 400 law enforcement officers from 25 agencies that responded. And one of the most important pieces of information that we didn't initially realize was so important, but was so crucial, was all of the post-action interviews that law enforcement officers did with essentially their superiors. which was law enforcement officers, in their own words, explaining what they did that day and why, which was really the first time in an American mass shooting that journalists and by extension the public got to understand, sort of the inside out of a response like this. So that was the trove essentially that enabled the rest of our reporting.
Zach, can I back up just 1 second? And when you talked about the public records requests and being stymied and being denied, and they're citing exemptions, how credible were those exemptions? I assume it was, well, it's an active investigation underway, and so therefore we need to withhold the stuff until we're finished investigating. The gunman was dead. We know who shot the kids. We know what happened that day. So why not release the information? Were there lawyers involved? Were other news organizations pushing on this in court?
All of the above. So, essentially we had filed about 100 records requests going to many of the agencies that had responded. And slowly but surely, in Texas, agencies have 10 days to give us an initial response. So we knew within about 2 weeks that we weren't going to get anything. Every single agency was immediately responding, and the process in Texas requires you to appeal the records requests if you want to withhold them to the Attorney General, and then they have about 2 or 3 months to rule. So within a few weeks, we knew that all of the agencies were trying to withhold the records. Within a few months, the AG did rule that they could withhold the records. And what each agency was citing was essentially all exemptions, but it specifically the ongoing investigation exemption that you had mentioned. And that was problematic for a lot of reasons, because they said every record you've requested, all 2 terabytes in total of the records, cannot be released because it could potentially interfere with an investigation. And it's important to remember, as you said, the shooter in this situation could not be prosecuted. He had died. And up until this point, the only officer who had ever been prosecuted that we know for a failed response to a mass shooting, or in general, was the Parkland, the school resource officer who had responded to Parkland. So there was a lot of skepticism that this ongoing investigation would even lead to a prosecution of the officers. So all of these agencies, led by the Uvalde DA, who was undergoing this investigation, were withholding these records indefinitely, and there was a skepticism that they would ever be released because it wasn't clear that there would be a prosecution ultimately. And so the Texas Tribune and ProPublica, along with about a dozen other news organizations, ended up suing in the fall of 2022. Those lawsuits are still ongoing. The city of Uvalde last fall did settle with us and ultimately released some of their records, which added a few more details, but we had reviewed most of them at that point. But the state police and the school district and the county sheriff's office continue to fight our records lawsuits.
So for the journalists in the room, really important sort of teaching moment, proceed along parallel tracks. Go the legal route, request the records, but also try to leverage your sources. Try to convince or persuade someone to leak important information to you.
Yeah, and actually on that point, the next point I wanted to make was on that same route, Ted, which was we got the records in October of 2022, which was several months after the shooting had happened. And one of the big questions I wonder about is why did the source that we got them from give them to us when obviously many reporters knew that these records existed in theory? Why did we get them? And I think the best explanation for that is we had done our best to do investigative reporting in those interim months without the records. I don't think the reporting was terribly revelatory, but we tried to build sources on the ground. Lomi and I had done some stories, tried to build sources, but I think that the sources that ultimately gave us these records saw that we were doing our best, were working with the community, and thought like these people seemed like they're trustworthy, they're doing good work, they would be good stewards of these records, and that's what ultimately won them over. So putting your best foot forward on that. The 2 terabytes, it's just like, we're talking like hundreds of hours of video footage, of audio records, thousands of images, documents, things like that. It was just a tremendous amount of information to process. So from a logistics standpoint, it was very difficult to kind of wrap our heads around, even what we have to figure out how to organize to build our investigations around. So from the start, we had a team that was much larger than the three of us, that we just spent a few weeks just going through the records to figure out what we had. We built a master spreadsheet. This is just one of the sheets on it. You can see on the bottom, like, the number of sheets from there extends well beyond all of those tabs. I can't understand or overstate enough the importance of, like, being organized from the beginning, and, like, how much that pays dividends in the long run. The footage, obviously, because this is a school shooting and we're talking about crime scene photos and autopsy photos and body camera footage, is extremely graphic. Because we were organized, it allowed us to not eliminate, but certainly minimize the number of times we had to review the most graphic parts of it, because we could take notes and refer back to those notes rather than having to look at the footage over and over again, which was helpful from a trauma standpoint. And it also allowed us to not have to kind of reinvent the wheel every time we did an investigation. We could sort of use this as this master template and do a bunch of investigations rather than have to do, like, a ton of legwork every time we tried to do a new story going forward with all of these. These are just a couple of stories that we did initially based on this before we got to the Frontline partnership. This was a partnership I think we'll talk about later this afternoon, and the partnerships panel. This is one we did with the Washington Post and ProPublica and the Tribune. A little three-peat, some lessons learned from there, but very cool story in the end about the medical response. And then another one that we did with ProPublica about the police, specifically in their post-action interviews, explicitly saying that they didn't enter the room once they learned that the gunman had an AR-15 style rifle, which was one of the revelations from specifically those interviews.
So then in year 2, this would have been the beginning of last year, we knew that we still had so much material in the body cameras, but also the post-action law enforcement interviews. And so we decided to partner with Frontline and go more comprehensively through all this material. I mean, we had gone through a lot, as Zach mentioned, but there was still so much. And so we pretty early on decided on the angle of training, because we were trying to answer, okay, there were nearly 400 officers there, including from, state and federal agencies. So what went so wrong? I mean, the big sort of takeaway was that no one took charge, and it was this little school police chief's fault, everything else. But there were so many other officers there, theoretically well-trained officers. And so how is it that, that nobody else did anything? So we partnered with Frontline, and again, just began to go more systematically through all the footage. This is, I think, one of the transcriptions of the body cameras. And so one other thing that we had to deal with was, because we didn't want to upload this material online or risk it being kind of coming out, we were actually, in the beginning, doing all manual transcriptions of both the body cams and the interviews, which was very time-consuming. But then later on, we developed this code that kind of did some AI-generated stuff, but we still had to go back and look at that. Play that for you right now. But we also, one of the other things that we had to do was, so we not only had to kind of place all the body cameras together. One of the things that Zach didn't mention, but he was key in, is a lot of the body cameras didn't have the right time codes on. So he kind of developed a system that we use later to correct the time codes. And so we kind of put them all together to sort of create this chronology. But we also, from that, use the body cameras and then the law enforcement interviews to identify officers in the body cameras, where they were, what time they arrived. And that helped Lexi, who's going to talk about that in a little bit, request their training records, and so that we could see what training they had actually received. This was just to give you an idea. I mean, we were working so with Frontline, we were making a documentary, but we were also doing kind of a narrative investigation at the same time, all in the space of about 6 months. So it was a lot of organization and a lot of different editors involved. And so we, to help that sort of early on, began sketching out how it could, sort of in time buckets, how we could possibly put this all together. That helped us later on when we did actually construct the documentary and the story. We also decided pretty early on this framing of both sides of the door for this story. And that was the idea that, the kids, we had also interviews with the kids among this trove of footage. And the kids were all saying, that they could hear the officers outside, and they were calling 911, and they were told to be quiet. And so, like, the kids were right there on this other side, on one side of the door, while the officers on the other side of the door were saying they didn't think anyone was inside because they were so quiet. So it was kind of that idea of that contrast. And then also on the kind of kids front in particular was a challenging part to handle. I lived in Uvalde for more than a month, just meeting with families of kids who had been there and kids who had died, because we decided early on that because of how traumatic this had been in that community, but also it was the right thing to do, that we weren't going to name or use any, we didn't use really any, we certainly didn't use graphic footage of children, but we also weren't going to name or use their audio interviews if we couldn't get their parents to agree. So that was sort of the purpose of that whole month, is just meeting with families who by that point, 2 years after, had already been traumatized by all the media coverage. So that was pretty challenging. But we were able to get several of them to agree, which meant we could use their audio interviews, which were really, really devastating, and some of the footage after they were rescued. And this is, we also just built on Zach's organization, and you can just see how many, many different timelines we had to try to put this all together, which was very complicated. And then I'll pass it to Lexi, who handled this sort of separate research part of the project.
Yeah, so as Lomi and Ted had mentioned at the beginning, our framing of the project with Frontline, both the online piece we did and the documentary, was around this concept of active shooter training. How after 25 years since the Columbine school shooting, were law enforcement still delaying so much in responses to these mass shootings after 25 years? So in order to understand that, we wanted to answer these few questions, and once we realized that there had not been a definitive piece that had answered these questions before, we decided that we were going to do it ourselves, since we could not find the answers. So one was understanding, what level of training within Uvalde did the officers have as far as active shooter training, and then in Texas and nationwide, what were the requirements as far as active shooter training at this point? And then taking another step back, in those 25 years since Columbine historically, how did the response to Uvalde compare to the others? Obviously, we know there have been other delayed responses, two of them, two of the most famous ones being here in Florida. So as Lomi mentioned, understanding the active shooter training within the officers in Uvalde was a bit of a challenge, because that took identifying each of them before we could even request their records. So this was a gradual process with us working very closely together, as Lomi was identifying officers through the body cam footage, through their after action reports. We would file the records requests, and we would slowly compile, we created our own database of what active shooter training that each officer had. And so this is what their reports looked like. There's a few, specific, it's typically called Alert in Texas, are the main courses for active shooter training. So we would go through each one and pull each of the courses that they had taken. And we created our own database. This is just a small snippet of it, but what we ended up finding is that most had taken at least one training since they had graduated from the academy, but clearly that had not been enough, and about a third hadn't taken any since the academy, which was a stark contrast to what all of the experts we spoke with said, which is that you need to have repeated training. You need to keep up with the different tactical lessons of how to respond. You need to continue practicing the response so you have that muscle memory, so that once you're in a situation like this, you don't just freeze. It's just an automatic response that you know how to do. So this was the finding in the story. As I mentioned, 72% of the officers that we had found, state and local, who responded did have some form of active shooter training, but it was not enough, as we said. And then digging deeper, one thing experts said is that typically, the more well-funded law enforcement agencies will have more training available to them, and that's exactly what we saw in this. We had the breakdown between state police, the city police in Uvalde, and the sheriff's office, and that's exactly what you saw as far as the training. The other aspect of this was doing 2 separate 50-state analyses of the current training requirements for both officers and within schools, which should be an easier thing to do than it is, but unfortunately it's, especially on the officer training side, an entanglement of laws and regulations and unwritten rules that make up this very difficult web to follow. So that took months and months of us tracking down, following up with the state agencies, sometimes multiple within the same state, to understand what exactly is required both in the academy and outside of the academy. And then we did the same for school districts. We actually decided to do this much later in the process. So about a month or 2 before publication, we decided to do the same 50-state analysis for what training is required within schools, which was a bit of a crunch, but the results were quite compelling. We ended up finding that at least 37 states across the country do mandate some sort of annual training within schools, these active shooter related drills, but only Texas and Michigan have laws that require those same equivalent drills for law enforcement. So across the country, we're requiring our teachers and students to have more training than we are for our police.
And the Texas law only came about after Uvalde, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we can pause here, Ted, if you want to. This was just our fact check document, but
yeah, let me start by asking and preface this by saying, I know we don't talk about our confidential sources, but let me ask anyway. The golden key to your reporting turned out to be the 2 terabytes of information that gave you a significant head start over what eventually was a Texas legislative report, sort of postmortem, also a Justice Department 600-page analysis of what went wrong in Uvalde that was published a month or 2 after your project. So you were ahead of the ball game. The golden key was the leak. How generally would reporters encourage a courageous insider, a whistleblower, to share very sensitive information when it's being bottled up in the courts and it's not being released through traditional public records means? And tell us a little bit about your efforts to protect your source. You said earlier you didn't want to upload anything to the cloud, presumably because you didn't want to get it leaked, but also you didn't want anybody filing a subpoena that could identify your source. Was there a leaks investigation? Did this person face consequences for what this person did? So whatever you're comfortable sharing about a very sensitive subject.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll share as much as we can about it. So we knew the records existed, right? And we knew a constellation of sources that, in theory, possessed them. So I think
there is a state police investigation going on, a DOJ investigation, and the DA was conducting an investigation, all who theoretically would have access, right?
Yeah. So like in general, cast a wide net is a good rule of thumb for most things that we do. I think there were potential sources that we viewed as more likely to give us the information. I will say that there were a couple sources that I got close with that ultimately like said no to releasing it, and that's fine. I mean, it was a little bit frustrating where I was like at the 1 yard line, and I respect people who said no. It was a huge ask. I mean, the pitch more or less was like, I mean, we knew that everyone was saying, all the government agencies were saying no. So it was like, we've exhausted all of the proper channels because we would rather get stuff the proper way. We are happy to do it the proper way. Our first instinct is not leak us the documents. That is the lazy way, I guess. The other part of the pitch is like, I think humbly we have a good track record of good reporting and that we are responsible about it. Because the other part of this obviously is the sensitive nature of this subject matter. And there was a protracted part of the discussion with these particular sources about like, how will you handle this source material? And without getting too much into that, we assured them like we're not gonna publish images
basically graphic
we're not gonna publish dead children. We're not gonna publish images of gore or blood, which we have never. And the second part of your question, we are not aware of any leak investigation, and not to say that there isn't or wasn't one, but we were certainly prepared that there would be one, and took precautions that there would be one. Like Lomi said, like we didn't use transcription services like Otter or anything like that, which we don't own. We, to the extent possible, like kept things offline completely and used computers that weren't, at least initially, connected to the internet. And because before the state reports were online, it was extremely sensitive material, extremely sensitive, that hadn't been public. So we were very careful about that.
And we had no reason to doubt. I mean, of course, we knew the sources would have access to this information, but also the way the file itself was organized. It's that FBI interview, and you listen to the interview, and it's an agent identifying himself as an FBI interviewing an officer. I mean, we had no reason to doubt the veracity of the information as well, right?
Mm-hmm. And especially for the young journalists in the room and those watching online, I want to emphasize a point that you made earlier. You had been writing credibly and with integrity and accurately about this, and so you were able to establish a reputation through your bylines that you could be trusted with this kind of sensitive material and sensitive content, that you weren't out to sensationalize and run up engagement. That you were doing very substantial, very serious journalism, and that's a terrific way to sort of embolden trust with some sensitive sources. So 18 months, you spent 18 months on this. Tell us a little bit about the logistics of planning and reporting such a competitive story. Everyone in America, all the news organizations were chasing this story. Walk us through your collaborative reporting and writing methods. You weren't necessarily in the same room next to each other frequently, so you were working remotely. What were some of the biggest challenges, and how did you overcome these?
I mean, as Zach said, when we first got the material, we did several stories pretty quickly, and then we partnered with the Washington Post to get out the medical story, and that was also done fairly quickly. I think about 6 weeks, right, maybe. And then he led the AR-15 story that was in the early part of last year, and then we partnered with Frontline. And part of that reason was because, although by that time, CNN obtained some material and published some stuff, NBC did some. They were based in Uvalde for 2 years, but I don't think they actually ever published this material. I can't recall. But it was very competitive, right? And so that's sort of why the first pace of the investigations were a lot quicker. Mm-hmm. But then we realized, all right, so people were just publishing sort of like, especially CNN, were like pieces of this. And that's sort of why we thought, what is this step back, and how do we put this all together? The documentary is more really just the police response. It doesn't focus on the children. So the police response from beginning to end and really very much in their own words, using the law enforcement interviews, and then the story is more the both sides of the door. And that was, I think, just because we realized there was still that vacuum, although there had been this much national attention to it.
Yeah.
And as for how did we, I think we all worked remotely. Like I live in Houston, they live in Austin. Our frontline colleagues were in Boston and New York. But we were all working with the material together and just communicating often. Especially towards the end, we had more than daily meetings. So.
And we have a panel this afternoon on collaboration, and you're going to talk about your experience with Frontline. So I won't dwell too much on that, but why Frontline? How did that sort of approach and pitch come about?
Well, honestly, it was led by our editors who wanted to partner with Frontline, and ProPublica has a standing relationship with Frontline. But I think that the reason for it was that, look, there's a lot of body camera footage in here. Like, while Zach and I and the Washington Post visual forensics team did an excellent job, and they separately made sort of a small documentary on their own, Frontline just has a lot of resources when it comes to, if we really want to overlay all these body cameras and all the law enforcement interviews. They have sort of the technical expertise where we're bringing the expertise on the ground and the reporting and the material.
Zach touched on this a little bit, the emotional toll of reviewing what turned out to be some really graphic material. Tell us about how, as a journalist, you process what you were looking through.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think it's hard sometimes to understand the toll it takes on you personally. I didn't work on this as long as Lomi and Lexi did. I largely stepped away from it after the AR-15 story published in March of 2023. And I think, at least for me personally, my wife told me at one point that I was just like angry a lot. Not anything in particular, just like irritable all the time. So I told the editors after the AR-15 story, like, it's been a year, like, I gotta not do this every day. So that was helpful, and they were supportive of like stepping away from it. It's hard, and we've talked about this sort of in prepping for this panel. To work at a news organization that's very supportive of like the work that we do, and understanding the toll that it takes, but also in a really competitive environment, it's hard to like balance those two things about like take the time that you need, but also we have these deadlines that we want to like meet for these things. So I think that as a field in general, and not to lay it all at the feet of ProPublica and Tribune, we're still figuring out how to meet those two competing goals. But I am happy that we are openly talking about how to meet them.
And it is important that editors recognize the trauma that their journalists sometimes can be exposed through, both visual photographers looking through the lens at awful scenes, reporters who are reviewing this material, interviewing victims themselves who have gone through trauma, and be mindful of that, and also that the companies themselves offer, ERP resources, counseling services when necessary. It's not always necessary, but sometimes it may be. Tell us about the dealing with the families of the victims. You were in Uvalde for over a month. How do you talk to parents of a child who was killed, or parents of a child who was wounded, or just who traumatically experienced this? How do you convey compassion genuinely?
Well, yeah, it was really hard, especially because, like I said, at that point, it was almost 2 years in. And so if any of you have covered mass shootings, I have before, typically what happens in the first 2 days, that all local, national, international media descend on a scene. You kind of find the families, and the first family that speaks to a reporter, they're still so shocked, and so they kind of, say everything. And then after that, kind of reality sets in, and the families no longer want to talk because they're legitimately grieving and going through trauma. And also, unfortunately, they've been harassed by that point by so many reporters. So this was 2 years in. That was tough because the families, for the most part, by that point had said, okay, we don't want to talk anymore. In fact, many of them had signs up still that said, if you're media, leave, or I will call the police. So that was like really difficult. It took a long time just to get people to open the door initially. But what helped is that so many of them were so desperate for information, and many of them didn't even know what had happened to their child. Like, obviously, both the ones who had lost children, but even the ones who still had surviving children and were suffering from trauma. So one of the things that we agreed I could do with my editors is I said, look, I have your child's interview with the therapist. Maybe it'd be helpful for you to hear that interview and hear what they went through, and then we can talk about it, and then explain what we were trying to do. We're trying to, we have all this material. We're trying to make sense of what happened that day. And I think because they were still so thirsty for knowledge, so angry and confused, that helped them to come on board. Now, some families never did, and unfortunately we couldn't use those, those interviews, but many of them did, and I think that was why.
It's a terrifically sensitive approach. We wanted to leave time for questions from the folks in the room and also from online. So do you have questions for our panelists?
Oh, 1 second. Sorry. Bring in a microphone. Just so everyone's aware, the speakers and everything are for the live streamers so that they can listen.
Oh, sorry. You mentioned that you got the interviews of the children talking to the therapists. What are the legal ramifications of that? Because I know that when you go to therapy, you can't really disclose the information.
Well, it wasn't really, sorry, I said that wrong. That's an important point. It was actually like an FBI agent who is interviewing. It's not like their personal therapist. Sorry, I said that wrong. They kind of call them like the FBI because it's especially people who work with children. They are, I believe, trained therapists, but this is not their own interviews with their own therapists. This was part of the law enforcement investigation. And so we only use them when their parents agreed that we could use those snippets. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's an important clarification. Yeah.
How and where did you securely store the dump?
We used hard drives, and we used individual ones. That way we wouldn't have them on a cloud.
On each of your computers? You all had the dump?
We used individual drives, yeah. That way there wouldn't be a single place that could be centrally located, yeah.
I just wanted to say that relying on confidential sources I don't think is cheating. I think source development is a skill that a lot of young reporters have lost over time, and a lot of people rely almost too much on public records. And working for an organization that fights for public records, increasingly states are now denying public records almost like as a default setting. So I think what you did was terrific, and I don't think it was cheating.
Thanks.
You mentioned that in the wake of this, Texas strengthened its training requirements for law enforcement dealing with school shooting. Did anyone step forward to try to change the public records law so that the public could know more about these shooting events than they currently do?
So no one changed that aspect. No one said, there's not a law now that requires agencies to release body camera footage after officer-involved shootings or mass shootings in general. There's not that change specifically. That would obviously be great. However, there was part of the law called the dead suspect loophole that changed after this, and it's a bit complicated to explain, but essentially it's a loophole that had often been used to withhold records, investigative records, into officer-involved shootings when the suspect died. So if there was a police shooting and they ended up killing the suspect, they would never have to release those records because of this loophole. And so that was a real fear in this situation because the shooter had been killed. So there was a fear that we would have these lawsuits go on for years and years and years, and then at the end, because of that, they would still be able to withhold it. So someone did close that loophole, which is an important aspect of it.
And in fact, in some other states, after school shootings, they go the opposite direction and they try to tamp down on the release of information. After the Connecticut elementary school shooting, the legislature was asked to pass a law that would prevent the release of the 911 call recordings from inside the school. And when I worked at the Associated Press, we fought in court and won, and were able to get access to the 911 recordings. But yeah, it's sometimes they even try to go the opposite direction and tighten down what can be released, because it is, sensationally traumatizing. You've got dead children, and it's an easy legislative move to make. Do we have questions from the online audience too, Rick?
Well, I have one.
Okay.
So I wonder if you can unpack just a little bit what happened post-publication. I know there has been more action in Uvalde in terms of criminal prosecutions, et cetera.
Well, we published. Do you want to use the clicker just real fast? We did several more stories looking at kind of after action reports. Oh, maybe we don't have that there. Never mind. We did several more stories, sort of looking at basically how rare it was to get all this footage in Uvalde, and like how after action reports typically, as in Pulse and Parkland, don't necessarily blame officers. And so after that, what happened is our story published in December and the documentary in December, and the next month the Justice Department released their 610-page report that they had spent 2 years on, but with many more people than us. And it essentially replicated a lot of our findings. They looked at the training of each officer there. They found that many didn't have enough training. They recommended, which was quite unusual, that each officer in the country going forward receive 8 hours of active shooter training a year, which they'd never previously done in other after-action analyses they'd done for other shootings. And they also replicated a lot of our findings, but importantly, like as in the narrative of what had occurred, but didn't identify most of the officers like we did. So that was, sort of comforting that we had kind of reached the same conclusions. And then shortly after that, the Uvalde district attorney launched or announced that she was prosecuting 2 officers, the school police chief and the first school officer that had arrived at the scene. So that is still ongoing. And it seems unlikely that they will face any charges, but that they will be found guilty, but that kind of criminal case is still ongoing. Is there anything else I missed there? Yeah,
there's a few other.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. You talked a bit about source building and reaching out to the different families. How did your approach differ when you tried to talk to law enforcement agencies and to get sources in that particular community?
So we reached out to, certainly all of the law enforcement officers that we ever mentioned at any point in any of the stories, but many, many, many more beyond that. We didn't have, correct me if I'm wrong, any interviews with any responding law enforcement officers for any of these investigations, which was unfortunate. The post-action interviews were a goldmine, and we let all those officers know, like, we have these interviews, like, we want to use them. We'd love if you could add anything you didn't have here or clarify or anything like that.
We sent them detailed questions and said, we have this in your interview, we're going to use this part potentially, and this part, and what about this part? So every officer named in every piece, we reached out to them personally on their cell phone, which we had as part of this job, but also to, if their lawyer, if they had an attorney, which many of them did, many of them, especially in Uvalde, are still under investigation, whether it's internally or it's now not by the DA, but at that time by the DA.
We did also share what we planned to report about the training that each officer had had with the individual agencies, so basically the underlying data for our analysis. And a few of the agencies did actually respond and correct little things, knowing that the records could be out of date. So the agencies themselves responded a little bit, but since all of the officers were still under investigation, none of them responded.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I wish they would have participated more, especially because I think that certainly some law enforcement agencies feel like some of the other law enforcement agencies unfairly criticize them, and I would have loved more context for that. But you can only do with what you are given with participation.
And it's tough because, I mean, they were at that point facing at that point they were facing the DOJ, the DA, and their own internal investigations.
Well, thank you very much for your compassionate, courageous, sensitive reporting. Congratulations on winning a really prestigious journalism award. It was great to see you at the White House Correspondents' Dinner last year. Rick, do you need to wrap it up?
Yeah, thank you, Ted, and thanks to all of you. Really a terrific presentation. I'll also mention this work was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So, and the winner of the Collier Prize. And we'll take a very short break and be back for our next panel in about 5 minutes.
Thank you all.